The iron gate stood between the gravel path and the empty lot. Mark stopped, his boots kicking up dust that settled slowly in the stagnant air. Beyond the metal bars, the space remained silent. Reclaimed by weeds and the wreckage of abandoned dreams, he stared at the barrier. It was not just iron and rust. It was a wall he had built for himself over 3 years of failed ventures. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the cold, flaking metal of the gate. It did not budge. The structure groaned under his touch, a low, metallic protest that echoed against the nearby walls. He pulled his hand back, watching the rust stain his skin. The silence of the morning felt heavy, pressing down on him, demanding a decision he had avoided for months. He looked up at the rusted padlock dangling from the latch. It was thick, stubborn, and locked tight. Every attempt he had made to start before had ended right here, at this threshold, with this exact lock staring back at him. He stood perfectly still, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the iron. The gate offered no invitation. It only held the weight of everything he had lost. Mark shifted his gaze to his own hand. It hovered inches from the padlock, vibrating with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor. He clenched his fingers into a tight fist, trying to force the muscles to obey, but the shaking only intensified. It was a tremor born of habit, a physical echo of every previous time he had stood at this exact spot and walked away. He reached out again, his thumb brushing against his palm to steady the nerves. His skin felt cold, bloodless. He took a sharp, jagged breath, the sound raspy in the quiet morning. Every time he moved closer, the tremor traveled up his arm, settling deep into his shoulder. He stopped, holding his breath, watching his own fingers twitch against the empty air. This was the threshold of his fear, the point where his body fought against his intention. He focused on the tip of his index finger, willing it to remain still, forcing the erratic motion to slow. He reached out once more, his pulse hammering against his throat. He did not look away. He forced his hand to extend, the movement jagged and slow, until his fingertips finally brushed the cool, rough surface of the lock. His fingers closed around the key. The metal was biting, sharp-edged and frigid, sinking into his palm. It did not feel like an instrument of access. It felt like a heavy stone, dragging his arm down toward the gravel. He stared at the brass teeth, seeing them as jagged markers of his own inadequacy. Every notch on the key seemed to represent a specific moment where he had miscalculated, overreached, and ultimately collapsed. He held it tightly, his knuckles whitening, the pressure of the key against his skin becoming a sharp, localized pain. He tried to raise it toward the lock, but his arm felt leaden, as if gravity had doubled its hold on him. The key was no longer a tool. It was a tally of his failures, a physical manifestation of everything he was about to lose again. He stopped mid-motion. The metal grew slick under his damp skin. He felt the temptation to let it fall, to hear it clatter into the dirt and walk away from the gate entirely. He held his breath, his chest tight and motionless, trapped by the sudden, paralyzing conviction that the lock would never turn for him. He stood in the silence, the key pressing into his palm, confirming the weight of his own doubt. The cold metal in his palm triggered a sharp, involuntary flinch. The scene around the gate dissolved. He was back in the small storefront from 3 years ago. He heard the metallic slam of the register drawer, the final, hollow sound of a business with no customers. He saw the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air of an empty room, the silence of a ledger book that had remained unopened for weeks. He felt the specific, sickening drag of his pulse as he turned the sign to closed for the last time. A phantom weight pressed against his shoulders, the exact sensation of walking out that door with nothing to show for his effort. Then, the memory sharpened. He heard the voice, distinct and biting, cutting through the silence of that long-abandoned shop. "You are not built for this." The words did not just echo. They reverberated against the inside of his skull. He saw his younger self staring at the floor, unable to meet his own reflection in the glass. The memory pulled at him, a gravity of its own, dragging his focus back into that previous wreckage. He stood in the current morning, his breath hitched, the ghost of that failure still clinging to his lungs, demanding he recognize the pattern. The first memory faded, only to be replaced by the second. He saw himself in a warehouse, boxes stacked high, unsold and gathering grime. He remembered the exact sensation of locking the heavy steel door, the sound of the key turning in a lock that he would never need to open again. Then came the third attempt. He visualized the meeting table, the stack of final notices, the way his hands shook as he pushed the paperwork across the desk. He watched himself walk out into the rain, empty-handed, the sound of his own footsteps echoing against the pavement. 3 times, the sequence repeated. Start, struggle, collapse. He saw the pattern clearly now, a jagged line of downward momentum. His muscles ached with the phantom fatigue of those long months. He felt the cold sting of the rain from that third failure on his skin, a lingering chill that refused to leave his bones. Each memory was a link in a chain that bound his current reach to the ground. He stood before the current gate, his hands trembling, the rhythm of defeat pulsing in his chest. The cycle was etched into his movements, a silent, heavy record of every time he had tried to move forward and been forced to pull back. The silence of the present was shattered. It did not come from the street or the wind, but from deep within his own memory, sharper than any living sound. You are not built for this. The sentence hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. His knees buckled slightly, his balance faltering on the uneven gravel. The key slipped from his fingers, clattering against the metal gate before falling into the dirt. He stared at the dust, unable to look up. The voice belonged to his father, and it carried the same cold, absolute authority it had held for decades. It was not a suggestion, it was an indictment. Every word replayed in his mind, stripping away the thin layer of resolve he had managed to construct. He felt his pulse quicken, not with ambition, but with the familiar, suffocating rhythm of self-doubt. He stood motionless. The air around him felt thin, difficult to draw into his lungs. The gate before him seemed to grow taller, the rusted padlock suddenly appearing like an insurmountable barrier. He could not move his hands. He could not reach down to retrieve the key. The echo of that single, damning assessment filled the empty space, drowning out his own thoughts and leaving him frozen in the shadow of a legacy he had spent his entire life trying to escape. The ghost of that voice was more restrictive than the iron bars of the gate. It was a phantom weight, pressing down on his shoulders, forcing his posture to slump. Mark watched his own hand hover in the air, trembling, refusing to obey the command to reach down. He realized then that the lock was not the problem. The true barrier was the internalized script he had been reciting to himself for years. Every time he hesitated, the voice grew louder, filling the silence with the rhythm of his past failures. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to isolate the sound, to see it for what it was. A recording, a relic of a different time. He flexed his fingers, fighting the rigidity that had taken hold of his joints. The air in the alleyway seemed to thicken with the pressure of those old expectations. He gritted his teeth, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, forcing a change in his physical stance. He had to break the connection between the memory and his current movement. He took a sharp, jagged breath, intentionally expanding his chest to push back against the invisible, crushing weight of that long-held doubt. He was not his father. He was not the sum of those failed attempts. He was the one standing at the gate. The path behind him was clear. It was a straight line back to his car, back to the routine of his previous life where expectations were low and the sting of failure was absent. Mark looked toward the street. It would be so simple to just walk away. No lock to force, no gate to open, no risk of another public defeat. The thought felt like a cool breeze on a humid day. He could be home in 20 minutes, sitting in the quiet, safe space where nothing was required of him. He would not have to explain himself to anyone. He would not have to face the judgment of the world or the crushing weight of his own high standards. The muscles in his legs tensed, leaning into the shift, ready to pivot. He let his gaze trace the route he had taken to get here, a path paved with the comfort of non-action. It was a familiar landscape, one he had navigated a dozen times after every previous attempt collapsed. The urge to return to that state of static existence was a physical pull, tugging at his heels, promising an end to the current anxiety. He stood there, caught between the heavy, rusted metal in front of him and the easy, hollow relief of walking away. Mark stopped the retreat before his weight shifted fully. He closed his eyes, cutting off the view of the street behind him. Instead, he forced his mind to render the image he had practiced every morning for 30 days. He saw the storefront. He ignored the rust of the gate and focused on the imaginary scent of raw pine and fresh sawdust. He built the soundscape in his head, the rhythmic tapping of tools, the hum of a busy shop, the bell above the door ringing as customers arrived. He felt the phantom weight of a key in his palm, not as a burden, but as a precision instrument. This was the drill. He had played this scene in his living room while the rest of the world slept, training his focus to override the panic. He breathed in, holding the vision steady against the intrusive static of his old fears. He could feel the texture of the shop floor under his boots and the cool air of the workspace. The more he sharpened the details, the more the alleyway around him began to fade. He was no longer just a man standing in the dark. He was the proprietor, standing at his own entrance, waiting for the lock to yield to his intent. The vision remained sharp behind his eyelids. Mark inhaled slowly, counting to 4, letting the air stabilize his pulse. The old fear tried to surface, a familiar coldness in his stomach, but he did not fight it. He simply acknowledged its presence and redirected his attention back to the mental blueprint of his business. He felt the weight of the metal key in his pocket. He reached in, his fingers brushing the cold, jagged teeth of the brass tool. He pulled it out, holding it steady in the morning light. The trembling in his hands was gone, replaced by the firm grip of someone who had already succeeded 1,000 times in his mind. He opened his eyes. The gate was still there, rusted and imposing, but it no longer looked like an obstacle. It looked like a threshold. He stood taller, planting his feet firmly on the pavement. Every muscle in his body felt aligned with his intent. He did not look back at the street or the path that led away from his goal. He looked only at the lock. He stepped forward, the distance between him and the gate closing with purpose. He was ready to stop imagining and start building. Mark reached the gate. He extended his hand, but as his fingers hovered inches from the rusted padlock, his breath snagged in his throat. A sharp, jagged inhalation broke the rhythm of his focus. His chest tightened. The silence of the alleyway suddenly felt heavy, charged with the weight of every previous failure. His father's voice, a ghost from years of negative programming, flared in his mind, echoing a singular, crushing verdict. You are not built for this. The air in his lungs felt trapped, unable to move. He felt the familiar pull of the exit, the urge to turn around and walk away, to leave the gate locked and the dream unstarted. It would be the easiest choice. His hand shook, a fine tremor rippling through his skin as he hovered at the threshold. He pressed his lips together, forcing himself to remain still. He fought the urge to pull back, to surrender to the old conditioning. He stood rooted, his breath shallow, his entire body poised on the edge of a retreat he was trying to dismantle. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer against his ribs, a physical manifestation of the war between who he was and who he had trained himself to become. The world outside the gate began to blur. Mark felt the grit of the pavement beneath his boots, but he pushed the sensation away, focusing instead on the darkness behind his closed eyelids. He squeezed them tight, shutting out the rusted metal and the gray morning sky. He willed the external noise of the city to fade into a hollow hum. His jaw, previously clenched in resistance, began to soften as he consciously released the tension from his face. He stood perfectly still, his body becoming a rigid pillar of intent amidst the damp morning air. He breathed in, not the stale scent of the alley, but the imagined air of his future. He reached into the quiet space he had cultivated through a month of disciplined practice. The ghost of his father's voice still flickered at the edges of his consciousness, but he countered it with a deliberate, singular focus. He constructed an internal wall, brick by brick, separating his current environment from the reality he was determined to manifest. He stood in the total darkness of his own design, waiting for the image to ignite. He was no longer reacting to the gate. He was preparing to overwrite it. The darkness behind his eyelids began to shift, fracturing into geometric light. Mark pushed the memory of the rusted gate aside, forcing it to dissolve like smoke in a strong wind. In its place, he built the shop. He visualized the front entrance, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. He saw the glass pane clear and polished, reflecting the morning sun instead of the grime of the alley. He focused on the door handle, imagining the cool, smooth texture of brass under his palm. He projected the interior into his mind, defining the layout of the shelves, the exact placement of the inventory, and the vibrant, organized flow of the space. He He watched the imaginary figures move through the aisles, the routine operations of a business that was already functioning in his mind. He refined the details, the crisp edges of the floorboards, the clean lines of the counter, the way light hit the signage above the entrance. He held this image steady, anchoring it against the intrusive pull of his surroundings. The rust disappeared. The cold metal of the gate transformed into the solid, welcoming frame of his ambition. He was no longer staring at a dead end. He was standing at the threshold of a finished, thriving reality. The vision deepened. Mark inhaled, and the stagnant air of the alley vanished. He smelled the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut cedar and sawdust, a fragrance that filled his lungs and grounded his pulse. He listened closely. The silence of the street was replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of a busy shop. He heard the faint chime of the doorbell ringing as customers entered, the soft thud of inventory being organized on shelves, and the muffled, productive murmur of commerce. These sounds were not distant echoes. They were immediate and tactile. He felt the vibration of the shop's activity in his chest, each sensory detail locked into place, creating an internal architecture that was more real than the rusted metal beneath his fingers. He breathed in the cedar again, letting it displace the lingering dread that had paralyzed him moments ago. The fear did not just fade. It was crowded out by the sensory density of his goal. He maintained the focus, balancing the smell of wood and the cadence of the shop until the alleyway ceased to exist in his consciousness. He stood in the center of his own creation, the reality of the business vibrating through him with an intensity that demanded physical action. Mark opened his eyes. The alley returned, but the perspective had shifted. He looked down at his right hand. The key rested against his palm, its metal surface dull and pitted with age. Before, this object had felt like an anchor, dragging down his resolve with the memory of 3 failed attempts. Now, the sensation changed. He closed his fingers around the bow of the key, testing the balance. It was solid. It was precise. He felt the cold steel bite slightly into his skin, a sharp, grounding reminder of the physical world he was about to command. He shifted his grip, sliding his thumb along the notched edge. This was not a burden. It was a lever. He considered the physics of the lock. The mechanism inside the gate was a series of pins, waiting for the exact alignment that only this specific cut of metal could provide. He realized the power was not in the lock, but in the tool he held. He rotated the key, watching how it caught the light, no longer seeing a rusted relic of past disappointment. He saw a solution. He saw the path forward. The weight in his hand became a concentrated point of focus, signaling that the door was not an obstruction, but a barrier waiting to be removed by his own deliberate motion. Mark squared his shoulders, shifting his weight to balance his stance against the rusted gate. He did not rush. He brought his right hand up, the movement slow and deliberate, a physical manifestation of the months of mental training he had endured. He reached toward the padlock. His fingers were steady, the tremors of doubt replaced by a cold, precise focus. He aligned the tip of the key with the narrow opening of the lock. For a fraction of a second, the metal caught against the edge, a tiny snag that threatened to stall his momentum. He did not pull back. He did not hesitate. Instead, he adjusted his angle by a fraction of a millimeter, feeling the grain of the metal against his skin. He pushed again. The key slid forward. It moved past the outer plate, deeper into the core of the mechanism. He felt the internal pins shift, one by one, giving way to the pressure of his hand. He continued the motion, a steady, unwavering glide until the shoulder of the key met the face of the lock. He stopped. He was fully committed now. The key sat perfectly in the chamber, a bridge of steel connecting his hand to the future he had built in his mind. He held his breath, waiting for the final connection to engage. Mark gripped the bow of the key. He did not twist immediately. He breathed out, feeling the tension in his forearm flow into the metal. He applied steady, increasing torque. The lock resisted, a stubborn, mechanical groan of iron against iron. He felt the pins binding, a final hurdle of his own past limitations fighting to stay locked. He did not blink. He pushed harder, his knuckles whitening, his pulse thumping against the metal. The resistance vanished. With a sharp metallic snap that echoed against the gate, the cylinder turned. The click was absolute. It was not just a sound. It was the physical termination of every "I cannot" he had ever whispered to himself. The shackle jumped upward, released from the housing. He felt the internal shift in his own chest, a sudden, weightless clarity replacing the long-held knots of doubt. The lock hung loose, swinging slightly from the hasp, no longer holding anything back. He stood still for a heartbeat, listening to the silence that followed the click. The barrier was gone. The internal programming had been overwritten by this single, decisive act of force. He had turned the key, and in doing so, he had unlocked the necessity of his own future. Mark reached out and pulled the shackle free. The metal was cold and rough under his palm, a heavy weight that he dropped into the dirt without a second glance. He gripped the vertical frame of the gate, his muscles coiled as he prepared to move it. He pushed. At first, the gate did not budge, held fast by years of neglect and grit in the hinges. He did not falter. He braced his feet against the uneven ground, leaned his entire weight into the iron, and shoved with everything he had. The hinges screamed in protest, a long, grinding sound of metal sliding over metal. Then, the resistance gave way. The gate swung outward, the arc wide and steady, cutting through the air until it hit the stop with a dull, final thud. Mark stood in the center of the opening. The view was unobstructed. The path ahead stretched out before him, a clear line of sight that had been hidden only seconds ago. He did not look back at the years of failure stacked behind that threshold. The space was open. The barrier that had defined his limitations for so long was now nothing more than a frame for the road he was about to take. He let go of the gate and stood in the silence of his new reality. Mark took the first step. The ground beneath his boots felt different, solid and promising. He felt the pull of the past, the gravity of every failure he had ever known, trying to drag his gaze backward. He refused. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the light seemed to sharpen. He walked past the rusted gate, leaving the threshold behind as if it were a shadow. With each stride, he found a rhythm, a steady, measured cadence that matched his internal resolve. He did not speed up to run from his history, nor did he slow down to analyze it. He simply moved, body balanced, mind clear of the old static. The path ahead was not paved, but it was open. He felt the air move against his face, fresh and unburdened by the stagnation of the previous years. He reached a small bend in the path and navigated it without hesitation. His hands were loose at his sides, no longer clenched, no longer searching for a grip on things that were gone. He was walking toward the harvest of his own persistence, one deliberate motion at a time. The distance between who he was and who he was becoming grew with every step he took. Mark stopped at the crest of the small rise. He looked down at his hands, open and steady, then back at the path he had traveled. The mental barriers that once seemed like stone walls were now just memories of a different climate. He inhaled deeply, the air filling his lungs with a sharp, clean clarity. This was the harvest. It was not a sudden windfall, but the inevitable consequence of 1,000 small decisions made in silence. He felt the weight of his own persistence, grounding him to the earth. He had replaced the old scripts of doubt with the consistent labor of his will. The result was visible in the way he stood, the way he occupied space without apology. He turned his attention back to the horizon. Every step he took now was an action of building, a physical manifestation of the intent he had cultivated for months. He felt no need to rush, for the harvest was already present in the rhythm of his own stride. He began to walk again, his pace measured, his focus absolute. The future was no longer an abstract fear, but a territory he was actively claiming. He moved forward, fully anchored in the truth that he was the architect of his own path.